I guess the good idea is very badly applied, and the bad idea is badly applied. In urbanism under New Labour, they sort of attempt to, I guess you can almost say, sort of re-urbanise the UK, which I think was quite a laudable aim, but which ended with this. This is a wasteland in Ancoats in East Manchester, which was slated for an aspirational housing scheme called New Islington, which has been derelict now for about 5 years. And the property developers who were given it to rebuild, it was previously a council estate, recently left the project, and it's now in the hands of Manchester City Council. It's just here as a general synonym for the kind of rather melancholy ending of the kind of New Labour chapter in British urbanism. So I'm going to kind of give a bit of background on why I was doing this, on the kind of some of the kind of ideas behind it, and also near at the end try and talk about what legacy this has left and how this is being treated under the coalition government. And I think there's almost danger, given their severity, that there'll almost be a nostalgia for New Labour in a couple of years' time. I want to offer a couple of preemptive correctives to that. And then at the end I'll offer a somewhat perfunctory couple of solutions, or possible solutions. So this is really based on research I did for the second book, Guide to the New Ruins of Great Britain, which takes the format of kind of a series of essays about different cities or different urban areas. There's a second part of it being written at the moment. It was originally a series for an architecture magazine called Building Design, which later of essays on cities during the recession. And given that the recession, is essentially showing no signs of ending and showing signs, in fact, of turning, the stuff is obviously still fairly topical. So I'm still doing the series for Building Design, and still trying to sort of catalogue some of this stuff, because in some cases there's schemes that are kind of on running, like the London Olympics, that won't be finished until 2012, but still very much the New Labour idea. Others which have been cancelled, and I'll get onto them at the end. So when I was writing this, when I was writing this, the book that I was all sort of reading on the train, really, was a book by Jamie Priestley called English Journey, which isn't a book about architecture at all, really, but was kind of written during the last economic crisis of anything like this scale in 1934, which was a journey from Southampton up to Carlisle. And one thing Priestley does, and it doesn't entirely make sense as economic science or as history, but it has a certain truth to it, in which I completely swiped from him, is a division of England. It's always England with Priestley. He doesn't go to Scotland, doesn't go to Wales. Into separate countries, and I think this is very opposite. I think we do live in very, very separate countries, sharing the same territory. The first of these is what he calls England 1. England 1 is represented by the Cotswolds, by the Lake District, by Oxford and Cambridge, by Durham, by Bath. It's a country which Priestley puts has long since ceased to earn its own living, which is, sort of preserved, patched up, attracts tourists from inside and outside the country, provides the kind of official face of England, but bears very little relation to where most of the population actually live, which in Priestley's time, and even more so now, is around 95% in cities. So This England one, Priestley thinks is kind of pretty, but he's fairly scathing about it. And this is also the England that the people that build England 2 aspire to live in. Well, there was the kind of, almost you could sort of say the original sin of British capitalism in lots of ways. Well, one of the many original sins of it, was that for various reasons too labyrinthine to go into here, and no one's really satisfyingly answered it. They didn't like, the bourgeoisie did not like cities. They built in cities, they attracted other people to cities. They themselves moved to the country as soon as they possibly could. With the exception of Liverpool and the cities of Scotland, the really wealthy, and also the exceptions of much of central London, the really wealthy have always preferred not to live in cities. And you can see this particularly in the north of England. But what they built was this. This is Sheffield. This is one of the kind of capitals of Priestley's England too. This is a series of cutlery works with some picturesque wasteland in front. This is a kind of country, the country which Priestley comes from. He's a Bradfordian and, so has this kind of identification with this country while being quite plain about how brutal it actually is, about how grim the conditions of those who live in it actually are. But at the same time as that, the same time as being, a country of massive exploitation and poverty, it's also the country that creates the trade union movement, the cooperative movement, and the Labour Party, although it fell out of their hands more recently. This England is then succeeded, according to Priestley, by what he calls England 3, which is exemplified for him by the factories along the Great West Road on the way out of London, but which could equally be, most of the kind of suburban and light industrial areas out in much of the West Midlands and much of the home counties. This is the Hoover factory. Well, it was the Hoover factory, now the Hoover building, which is a Tesco's, in Perivale in West London. My dad grew up opposite this, and my grandmother worked here for a while. But this is Priestley kind of looks at it with scorn, really. He looks at this and sort of says, this can't be a factory. A factory is 10 stories high, it's blackened with smoke, it's got giant chimneys, you can smell it, This is not a factory. And they're making silly things, they're making labour-saving devices, and they're making, shaving cream and sweets, and he just disapproves of it. But at the same time, it brings in its train a kind of consumer culture, and also a culture of property, something which had been out of the reaches of most of the working and most of the middle classes, suddenly becoming accessible to them. So this is an area of suburban expansion, of little houses with gardens, of increasing fixation of privacy, but it's also in some ways a more democratic country, one that's less obviously hierarchical, and one that's much more Americanized. This continues, but it's also kind of followed, partly due to Priestley's own influence, by something which he doesn't call, because he's not there yet, England 4. And this is the kind of England of the post-war settlement, really, of the kind of post-war compromise between labour and capital, of the kind of decades of social democracy, accepted by both Labour and Tory parties, that you would have a large welfare state, you would have full employment, and you would have an enormous amount of state investment in housing. This is kind of an example I use partly just because I think it's extraordinarily good, of a council housing block in Forest Hill, South London, called Dawson Heights. So this is an England which has sort of been subject to a great deal of bad press, and I earn a living as an apologist for it. It's a country in which I argue in both books really came closer to realizing any attempt at democracy and social justice than any other phase in British history. If anyone wants to disagree with that, please do. It was also, however, continued to be an era of expansion of retail and of comprehensive redevelopment of city centres. Here you can think of the Arndale centres that smashed up many of the city centres across the north of England. You can think of the kind of ever-expanding virus that is Eldon Square. But here I've got a rather more encouraging example, like the Castle Market in Sheffield, where I think there was some attempt to build a kind of coherent and enjoyable city centre, which has since been subject to decades of ever more increasing dereliction. This is then succeeded from about the late 70s onwards, after the oil crisis and after the successful confrontation with the trade unions, with something which, kind of following Priestley, I'm calling England 5. England 5 continues, really, but England 5 has two very different moments. The two images I have here are both embarking in where kind of London turns into Essex. And they're both, sort of outer suburban private schemes, one of them a shopping centre, one of them a development of luxury flats. But in aesthetic, they couldn't be more different. Neither of them serve the sort of clients that England 4 did. Neither of them are public schemes in any way, shape or form. But what they are is sort of two different poles of British neoliberalism, two different poles of the successive transfer of public assets into private hands. The first of them goes, has a sort of traditionalist form, at least a traditionalist aesthetic, combining with a far from traditionalist expansion of car networks, of suburbanisation, and so forth. Both of these schemes are on former industrial land, it should be pointed out. Well, this one is ostensibly more urban. It's a block of flats, it's high density. In aesthetic, it's modern. Modernist is more debatable, but it's certainly modern in some manner. And I think that the kind of transition from the different phases of this England are really what this is all about, and what I'm going to talk about over the next 10 minutes or so is really the kind of birth of Blairite urbanism, really, of where it comes from and what it's reacting against, and why it kind of starts as quite a good idea. So we begin really with a kind of Thatcherite response to deindustrialization, which is a thing called the enterprise zone. They're bringing these back, so you should. It's well worth reminding yourself of what they meant first time around. Enterprise zones entailed the kind of tearing up of the planning rule book, of sort of taking an area and removing all planning controls from it and letting capital do what it likes. So, included in this moment, which I guess best associated with the Tory planning minister Nicholas Ridley. You could think of Meadowhall Shopping Centre outside of Sheffield. You could think of Trafford Centre outside of Manchester, and most of all, the kind of most kind of gigantic and grotesque of all, the Metro Centre in Gateshead. These schemes were kind of intended to turn around the fortunes of former industrial cities. What they usually entailed was jobs from that were previously being concentrated in one area being moved to another. They actually generated apparently as little as 10,000 new jobs in their existence from the early 80s to the early 90s. So in terms of actually kind of restoring these places to some sort of economic health, they were an overwhelming failure. But a lot got built. And the only one that really was an economic success, partly because it was basically a financial district a couple of miles away from the City of London, and also had enormous public investment in the form of the Docklands Light Railway, was London Docklands. And London Docklands can be seen as almost as a kind of like Los Angeles version of London. That you have on the one hand the kind of shiny glass skyscrapers, and then this from a distance this gives the impression of kind of some sort of hyper-urbanity. But actually, if you walk around Docklands, you'll find that those skyscrapers are surrounded by acres and acres and acres of suburban housing, some of which in recent years are starting being demolished and being replaced with more high-density stuff. But the initial idea, kind of best exemplified by this scheme in the Royal Docks, which got the specific approval of the Prince of Wales, was low-rise, fairly low density. This is one of the slightly high-density ones, in fact, and a very, very traditional aesthetic. You know, a kind of insistence that the attempt to kind of convert the British public to modernism had failed, and a good thing too, etc., etc. So here almost you have this kind of alliance of neoliberalism and feudalism, and that the Prince of Wales suddenly becomes this kind of enormously important figure in architecture and planning. But I digress. But one of the interesting things about this, and something that's often overlooked, I think, is that the aesthetic and planning policies were very, very similar, but when employed by people who are politically completely opposed to this. This is close of houses in the centre of Liverpool. This is dead centre of Liverpool. You walk 10 minutes here and you're in the Pierhead. This is the inner city, basically. And this was built by Liverpool Council when it was under the control of the Trotskyist organisation Militant. And their response to the housing problems of Liverpool, in which several system-built towers were built, which quite rapidly deteriorated, was to demolish the lot and build low-rise houses with gardens in their place, with a very traditionalist form. And this drastic solution made them very, very popular. Every election they fought, Militant got a bigger and bigger vote. So, you know, it had some success. The thing of it is that it's completely anti-urban. And it's especially kind of depressing in Liverpool, which is one of the most urban of English cities, that it's almost like everyone in there decided that they really wanted to live in Basingstoke. It's a bit of a shame, really. Although what it does do is that it ensures that working class families still live in the centre of Liverpool, which is not the case with much of Blairite urbanism. Oh, back one. So where this kind of comes to a head, and the ironies with this are so huge, really, that I'm always amazed that it's not talked about more often. Where this kind of comes to a head is over an area of inner London called Coin Street. This is just kind of between Waterloo and Blackfriars stations. A large, again, ex-industrial area, which developers proposed to fill with this. This was a scheme by the soon-to-be Lord Richard Rogers. It was very, very high density, it was ultra-modernist, and I mean, it was by an architect at the absolute height of his powers, who was around the same time designing the Lloyd's building, which is probably one of the finest 20th century buildings in the country. But anyway, Rogers' idea of kind of rehabilitating modernism, of rather than it being kind of monolithic and concrete, of it being kind of having lots of public space and lots of different skylines and lots of architectural variety, and the kind of high-tech rather than monolithic aesthetic, that it was immediately associated, rather than with the local council, which is the sort of client Rogers would have been working with if he was 5 years younger, it was instead associated with a private developer. And the council themselves, the Greater London Council as then was, successfully opposed this scheme. And what they put in its place was something much like the development in Liverpool I showed just before. Low-rise, low-density suburban housing, slap bang in the centre of a city of 8 million people. And somehow, over the kind of course of the next 15 years after that, Rogers, who was a Labour Party supporter and used to be keen on quoting Herbert Marcuse to meetings of the Royal Institute of British Architects, kind of gets the ear of Labour. A book is produced in 1992 with Rogers in collaboration with a Labour minister called A New London, in which he kind of envisages this European-style city of cafes, squares, art centres, inner-city housing, And after New Labour come to power in 1997, this comes to pass. Something which previously they'd basically opposed in their kind of left-wing pomp is now accepted. And the first place where it's really tried out, I think, is again, as it almost always is, a former industrial area in southeast London called the Greenwich Peninsula. Here, Rogers designs the Millennium Dome, now the O2 Enormo Dome, which is owned by a Christian businessman called Philip Anschutz, and is now kind of inside. It's in some sort of weird kind of Miami Art Deco style. It's a very strange place. So there's the giant cultural centre, which in this case quite quickly became a laughing stock, and there's the housing that accompanies it, which here is by an architect called Ralph Erskine. And Erskine's aesthetic, modernism definitely, but a modernism which derives from Scandinavian models rather than the kind of harsher modernism of 1960s Britain, where you get lots of kind of painted wood on the facades, lots of kind of staggered skyline, lots of bright colours, as much nature as you can kind of bring into the site. And apart from the painted wood, these are all very good ideas. And Erskine kind of does this, first of all, in Byker, which I'll come back to at the end. A large estate, which I'm sure most of you know, in Newcastle, which was considered by people like Rogers to be, a kind of solution in many ways to the failings of many modernist redevelopment schemes. So at this point, really, in about 97 to 99, you could almost believe that they'd got it right. That, dome aside, that, that a kind of modernist, urban, high-density kind of form of planning and architecture, often quite well connected by public transport. This is very near to a tube station, which was built especially. That it's all starting to come together. Certain things are still missing, of course. One of the things that this place, the Greenwich Millennium Village, as known, was keen to do was to introduce what they called mixed communities by having houses for sale at market rate and also houses for sale to key workers. What it didn't have is council housing. And throughout the New Labour years, and even more so in the last couple of years, council housing waiting lists expanded and expanded and expanded. But they certainly weren't rehoused in places like this. But after kind of, the kind of upshot, really, if we're being particularly pessimistic, of this Blairite urbanism, where Richard Rogers, as head of the Urban Task Force, and writing various government papers recommending high density in city centres and city living, and et cetera, the terminus of it, if we're being pessimistic, is this. There's urbanism like this. This is a block of flats in the centre of Sheffield. And I think kind of all the vices of this kind of version of planning derived at several removes from Rogers and from Ralph Erskine is really apparent here. You've got tiny, weeny little flats where the kind of essential meanness of the whole scheme is dressed up by different cladding materials, by bright colours, by a thin veneer of brick on the concrete frame. Well, previously in a modernist scheme, you would have had orientation to the sun, you would have had large Parker Morris style, flats. You would have had a certain amount of, it might look harsh, but quite often the reason why it looks like it does is because it's designed from the inside out. These are designed from the outside in. And they are also, as so often with these, right up against particularly inhospitable bits of urban space. Any laws about building along railway lines, about building along motorways, etc., these all got abandoned, basically. You can build anywhere you like, more or less. And the quality is not particularly important. But it doesn't look harsh. It doesn't look harsh and mean like 1960s modernism did. It's a kind of modernism of appearance, really, of sort of ingratiating dishonesty. And that kind of accompanies the rather more high-end version of it, where Richard Rogers and his former partner Norman Foster designed several kind of cultural, governmental, and office buildings. This one in particular I've chosen because it partly sums up what happened to local government. There's a scheme called More London, which is just by Tower Bridge, sort of in between Tower Bridge and London Bridge. And it's a private scheme, private security, privately owned, private space, no public right-of-way. You know, a kind of ersatz bit of city, entirely designed and planned by Foster, which, you know, the developers leased out one part of this kind of testicular building here, to the Greater London Authority for its new headquarters. So London's kind of body of government rents from the developers here, and you know, and this kind of private bit of mock city. And similarly, in cities which don't have the kind of speculative housing booms enjoyed by London or Edinburgh or Leeds or Manchester, there's a huge amount of student housing, partly to cater for the increasing numbers of students, but partly also to cater for the fact that students were being encouraged to demolish their halls of residence and sell off their land. The developers that kind of stepped into the breach here were a firm called Unite, enthusiasts for prefabrication. And so if anything, you know, the kind of glib line on this is that they're the Ronan points of the future. These are the kind of system-built towers that future generations will go, you know, what were we thinking, et cetera, et cetera. Well, what we were thinking was that we were doing this instead of the mistakes of the 1960s. This is an area called Grand Central outside Liverpool Lime Street, and it kind of has most of the features of the Unite style. Very high density, extremely low architectural quality, tiny flats inside, tiny windows, and the obligatory aspirational name. The other element of kind of urban task force ideas, and something that Rogers has been pressing for since the 80s, was the relocation and the expansion of cultural facilities in the centre of the city. One of the, again, this is entirely a good idea, and it would be churlish to criticise it in principle. The problem with it is that it kind of essentially becomes, you know, a sort of Trojan horse for an area's gentrification, and usually for extremely poor quality housing, which often tries to emulate the iconic building it's built around. One of the best examples of this, actually probably a better example than this, is Baltic Quays in Gateshead, where just around the Baltic you've got these flats that have the same colours as the Baltic, they're about the same height, crappy little flats inside, you know, minimal architectural worth, but which try quite hard to be in keeping, you know. And you build your icon and you build the private housing around it. And this example here kind of shows, you know, this is the Laban Centre by the architects Herzog and de Meuron in Deptford, southeast London, quite near to where I live. And this scheme was designed for a dance school and designed by the architects, partly with lots of reference, I mean quite subtle reference, but you know, not very sledgehammer reference, but definitely reference the fact that it was surrounded by light industry, surrounded by lots and lots of corrugated sheds and by the thin Deptford Creek. And you can kind of, it was designed completely with those things in mind. Of course, as soon as it's finished, that light industry goes and becomes replaced with blocks of flats, which in turn then try and emulate the Laban Centre's own language. So you get this sort of bizarre loop, really, of redevelopment. Oops. The other thing that happens, and this really I think is one of the most malign elements, most of the others you can find some sort of scheme there that's got some worth, but here I think one which I don't think has any apologists whatsoever, is almost you could say the return of the Arndale centres. That rather than having shopping malls on the outskirts, you build the shopping malls in the centre of town. instead of the metro centre, you get the, expansion forever and ever and ever of Eldon Square. And the best example of this is my hometown of Southampton. This is West Quay, which when built was the largest inner city mall in the country. It recently got overtaken by Westfield in London. This, again, on former industrial land, on a cable works, which is about about a mile or so long, got replaced with this sort of gigantic bunker of shopping, which has, again, much the same effect that an out-of-town shopping centre would. The case against out-of-town shopping centres was always that they leached shops away from the inner city, then turned the inner cities into ghost towns. The jobs that they provided were mostly substandard, ununionised service industry work, and that they encouraged people to come in and get out. That they didn't linger. That they didn't no urban life happened in their train. And this is exactly what happens in West Quay, even though it's slap bang in the centre of the city. It's got very, very good connections to the M27, so people just drive in and drive out from the surrounding area, which is mostly, the New Forest and lots of commuter towns, and is very affluent. They don't linger, and the original high street is roughly half derelict and half turned over to chain pubs of various sorts, and it's not a nice place on a Saturday night, I can tell you. But there's an attempt, interestingly enough, by the same architects, Building Design Partnership, to then make this nice at Liverpool 1. And Liverpool 1 architecturally has some virtues. It has quite nice walkways, it has a very nice park as part of it, there's a bit of variety in the design. It's also much like somewhere like Moor London, and like any shopping mall, completely private space, no right of way, no real sense that it's part of the city. As you know immediately as soon as you've walked into Liverpool 1, you know you're not in the rest of Liverpool, you know you're in a shopping mall. But it's an example of an idea brought in from Los Angeles, the idea of malls without walls, of trying to make shopping malls feel like parts of cities rather than gigantic bunkers like the Arndales and their successors. And in this, it's reasonably successful. Lots of people come in from Cheshire and now shop in Liverpool. One of the things that's sort of rather melancholy about this one is that it does actually, have some quite good design ideas, while at the same time being in some ways the death of any idea of real cities. It was also imitated quite soon after. Much of the centre of Sheffield has been demolished for a Liverpool 1 style scheme called Sevenstone that recently got cancelled and is likely to remain derelict for the foreseeable future. The other element, and really the underlying story of all of this, is the kind of colonisation by the middle classes, or the attempted colonisation by the middle classes, of former spaces of working class labour and working class housing. And with former spaces of labour, it's obviously, rather less offensive. You can see this in the innumerable factory conversions, the cotton mills all over Manchester that have been turned into luxury flats, the dock warehouses along the Newcastle quayside, and this sort of Doge's Palace cum carpet factory, now flats in Glasgow. Much more dubious is the move from taking over disused factories to taking over allegedly disused but frequently not disused housing, which is frequently by the same developers. And here I should bring in my personal bête noire, the property developers Urban Splash, who were responsible for two schemes which I think sum up really the arrogance with which New Labour regarded its traditional constituency by the end. The fact that it seemed to think it could do whatever the hell it liked in working class areas. And it didn't matter because they're always going to vote for us, aren't they? That this is a scheme that happened because of a government sort of planning grand idea called Pathfinder, which, again, I'm sure some of you will know about, which entailed the large quantity of public funding for the demolition of usually council-owned 19th century, often in the case of, in some cases, such as in Sheffield, 20th century housing, and its replacement with what was usually termed aspirational new developments, which would not, and this was very clear, be offered to those who had been cleared from the area. In some cases, Pathfinder money was used for quite good things. I know architects have used it to build, community centres in Stoke and what have you, but to a large degree, most of it was spent on demolition. And in one case, an area was saved for demolition and handed over entirely, not bought, not sold, handed over to Urban Splash, where they built what is known as Chimney Pot Park. Chimney Pot Park is a kind of, an old Mancunia theme park for media workers. It's a series of facades underneath which are steel-framed flats, which give the appearance of, according to the marketing bump, you can own your own Coronation Street home. This is in Manchester, Salford specifically, but this is just like, there's acres of these, but this one is clean and safe and not inhabited by any undesirables. And so while it kind of preserves the architectural face of the old terraces, the people that lived in them, and indeed much of the actual fabric of the buildings themselves, were completely abandoned. On an even more massive scale, and still in, unlike Chimney Pot Park, in progress, is the redevelopment of the Park Hill estate in Sheffield. A very large council estate right in the centre of Sheffield, which you could almost, by its encouragement, by the fact it's got lots of public spaces, by the fact that it had shops and schools and several pubs as part of it, was almost exactly the sort of thing that people like Richard Rogers was saying should be built in cities. But it had the wrong kind of people in it. So again, given by a city council, by a Labour council, sorry, I sound like Neil Kinnock, given by a council to Urban Splash, residents cleared from most of it, and in this case, with large quantities of money, both from the Homes and Communities Agency, a government quango, and from English Heritage, they destroyed most of the fabric of what is a Grade 2 style listed building and replaced it with anodized aluminium panels. So almost at the same time as they kind of got rid of the inhabitants, they almost had to turn it into a different building in order to be able to sell it. And again, with this, the bottom has very much fallen through. Most of this is stalled. It's there's about 6 interconnected blocks, one of which has been urban splashed, another 3 of which are derelict, and 2 parts of it are actually still inhabited. And if you walk around there, if you walk around the walkways, you can actually see people do, as was originally envisaged by the architects, do stand around and chat, and people leave outside people's doors. There's often seats so that they can sit around and chat on the walkways. It's amazing considering how demonized it is that it actually seems to work pretty well, but not well enough. So that's where we kind of leave it, really. That was what New Labour urbanism ended in, was government sponsorship for class cleansing, essentially. And the government sponsorship that came with that has basically come to an end. And this has several consequences, the first of which is huge swathes of dereliction. I mentioned Sevenstone and Sheffield earlier on, but an even better example is Middlehaven in Middlesbrough. Again, another former dockside industrial area, completely cleared, replaced with various, mooted to be replaced with various aspirational blocks and giant sculptures by Anish Kapoor. Only the giant sculpture by Anish Kapoor has actually been finished. The rest of it is a gigantic and astoundingly bleak wasteland. This in a city which has been hit hardest by the crisis than anywhere else, has more people in public sector employment than anywhere else. The interesting thing, the thing that's really worth pointing out here is that the public sector employment and the expansion of the public sector that in many ways alleviated the unemployment of this area was frequently quangos who were involved in one way or another in trying to convince the private sector to invest in Middlesbrough. That actually what's presented as a failure of the public sector is actually a failure of the public sector to kind of to kind of resuscitate the private sector, to kind of breathe life back into it, which mostly, and certainly in the case of Middlesbrough, failed. So the narrative opposing the two, opposing the public and the private, in the case of New Labour, is often hides a much more complex reality. The other cancellation is building schools for the future. Again, you know, a scheme which had some quite good ideas. You know, it frequently involved, you know, some investment, some public investment in education. What it also involved was was a bias against refurbishment and the construction of some frequently very shoddy buildings. I mean, this one had, you know, looks like a business park on the edge of the M25 rather than the school in the centre of Sheffield. But the attack on building schools for the future accompanied Michael Gove, the new education minister's attacks on architects. Architects were suddenly the kind of villain of the piece. Richard Rogers pointed out about his free schools that, Michael Gove pointed out his mooted free schools, of which apparently 100 schools were going to apply to, but actually it was about 10, that we won't get Richard Rogers in to design your school. And we won't get Richard Rogers in to plan your city. That Rogers himself, along with the policies that he pioneered, have become, you know, punch bags for the government in many ways. The other thing that was cancelled is, oh God, I've gone too far. Oh God, hold on. No, there wasn't. Aha! The other thing that was cancelled was Pathfinder. Pathfinder has been basically abolished, all its funding gone, and in many ways, it's quite hard to resent this. It's quite hard to say, you know, well, this was a marvellous scheme which should have continued to get public money. But the complete withdrawal of funds simply means that those areas that are derelict, waiting for demolition, of which there are many, are going to be left derelict again pretty much indefinitely. This is again from Middlesbrough, pointing out there that even squatting it isn't going to be easy. So to end then with some examples of how things could have been done differently. The first scheme that kind of comes to mind is Homes for Change, an area of Hume in inner city Manchester, where those cleared from a demolished council estate insisted on being rehoused together and insisted on certain design features that were taken over from the previous estate, such as walkways, open space, and so forth. And again, you know, this is low income, not council, but at least social housing, that works very, very well and has, you know, a genuine kind of sense of place and almost, you know, almost of solidarity to it. It is, however, you know, it's mostly inhabited by, I guess, sort of Greens and activists and, you know, kind of mung bean eating types, who perhaps might not be, you know, that their cohesion might be to do with the fact that they were already quite cohesive before they were moved. And it's also, as was pointed out to me the last time I said how great it was, it's also a gated community. That there are gates, most of the time which are open, but which are closed at night, which prevent access to the walkways and to the ostensibly public open space. So it's quite an ambiguous scheme in lots of ways, but I think it's better than most. It has many ideas in it which could have been taken up and mostly weren't. But the scheme that I would really say, you know, shows lots of evidence for, you know, how things could have been done differently, is again Byker, is the gigantic council estate in Byker, which again I think was, you know, one of the inspirations for New Labour urbanism. Not only in the fact of Erskine getting the Millennium Village, getting their kind of big flagship project, but also in the fact that Erskine's design language was borrowed absolutely everywhere, i.e. kind of concrete frames clad in various kind of panels and bright colours and bits of wood and so forth. But here it's done really, really well. And I think one of the things that was key about this was that it was done over a very, very long time. It took about 12 years to build, and it was interrupted when it was actually still in progress in 1981. If something like this is going to be done well, it's going to be taken seriously, it's going to take a long time, it's going to take a lot of money, and also it will have to house council tenants. That rather than kind of, you know, put more and more pressure on a council waiting list and, you know, and an increasing kind of divide in housing. No one's ever adequately explained to me why we shouldn't actually build in council estates. And so both in design terms and in social terms, and it's recently actually got some sort of big society award of some description, so it can be run by a community trust of some sort. But this at least shows that it still, it still manages to instill some sort of sense of place in the community and so forth. And it's still very, very popular. And I think in many ways, it's this scheme interrupted in 1981, rather than much of what's happened in the last 15 years, that we should be looking for inspiration. Anyway, I'm going to stop there. Thank you.